Hey there, this is Dan, and screw the normal intro because you know what it is. This is the ultimate Warcry competitive tier list. This has been sort of the culmination of a whole bunch of work over the last several months for me, and I couldn't be more excited to bring it to you. First, let's do a quick rundown on the deets, right? So I'm going to be, for the most part, using the competitive lists from my starter lists series. Um, you can check those in my backlog. Otherwise, I'll just link to some of them in the description down below. There are going to be some exceptions. Seraphon, I'll explain more on that later. Some of the top 5 budget lists are here. For certain warbands where a couple different approaches lead to sort of different places on the tier list, I've put both of the two competitive approaches, but there's some others like say Bone Splitters or Fire Slayers where one was just much higher than the other, and who cares about the lower one, right? So then, what does competitive mean for the purposes of this video, right? I see a lot of people online, for example, say Warcry is just a casual game right now, so there is no competitive. That's a perfectly reasonable, to be honest, a perfectly reasonable approach to take, but I prefer not to, right? I want to treat this as if we are looking to min-max the game. I do think that there are going to be Warcry tournaments, over the course of the next months and year, at least before there's a new update to the game. And also, just some people like looking at what it looks like to min-max in this game. Um, I am going to include allies, same framework as my starter list series, where allies are only included where they really add to what the warband is doing. I'm not going to worry about, um, you know, testing the contorted epitome in every single list, just some of the ones that, it fits best in. Um, I'm also sort of assuming kind of a 75% above ground, 25% catacombs, just putting in a little bit of consideration for what catacombs are like, but not a ton. That's something that just a quick detail I left out in my math video that, some of the ratings on certain abilities, things like that are assuming that you're usually going to be above ground, but I'm not just throwing catacombs out of the game because I know it's a way that a lot of people really love to play, and some people think it's more balanced. We're also assuming that you're running into a tournament that it just sort of has an unknown tournament pack, but has been built, at least in a reasonable way, right? We're not assuming um, sort of some of the more crazy deployment and victory conditions that are out there. I also just want to recommend Rito's 5.1 tier list. I'm going to link that as well in the description down below. Um, he has done so much work putting together tier lists for Warcry for ages now, longer than I've even had a channel. He's been doing it. And so, you know, ton of respect to all the work that he's done. I really hope that you check that one out if you haven't already. And there's some really interesting differences between this and that one. So stay tuned. I'm going to start with the lowest two tiers. The first is, we'll just call F for fail tier, right? These are four poor, unfortunate warbands where even when they're min-maxed as much as they possibly can be, they produce things that are underpowered even in a casual setting. Um, Things like Tzeentch Demons, they do have access to one really good shooter, but it's not their leader. It's pretty expensive. It's really hard to field more than two of them. Another approach you could take is going with a lot of split, but um, split is tough because any kind of tuned warband is going to be able to not attack a pink horror until they're ready to kill it, and then just shoot it down in just a couple activations after it's already moved. Um, so you're just going to have a really tough time putting together something competitive with Zeech Demons. Although, um, the two things that it does well, sort of the split mechanic and shooting, they're pretty good for pub stomping. So in a casual setting, they're easily at the top of F tier. Uh, top of F tier, huge, huge success. Um, they're easily at the top there just because new players are going to really struggle to play against them, even though in any kind of competitive setting, I think that they're going to have a really tough time. Fire Slayer is a quick note. They are the lowest one here. I'm using the High Sentinel list. That one scored much higher than the other one. This is the one trying to get kind of burst damage with a Grimwrath Berserker. That one scored much higher in the rating algorithm that I created. That again you can check out in my Math Hammer video. Otherwise, we've got, the classic meme faction, which is Nurgle Rotbringers, and Night Haunt are also bringing up the rear. I do want to talk about Iron Golems and K-Knight Shadowstalkers. So Shadowstalkers especially came in pretty balanced in the budget tier list, and but here they're in D for dreadful tier. So what gives? The main thing there is that they don't benefit that much from getting an extra box or two. All of their options are sort of pretty close together in power level. So their most competitive warband that I could create only scored a couple points higher in terms of the rating algorithm than the budget one did. Um, so they are here in D tier, though, you know, these are not garbage factions, right? So Iron Golems and K-Knight Shadowstalkers, maybe not most, but at least a lot of casual lists you see people running in, say, battle reports or letting you know this is what they're trying out on Reddit or Discord, right? A lot of those actually end up falling here into D tier if you were just going to look at competitive lists, which is here, right? So that can be really unfair to something like Iron Golems, where they you can actually put together a list of that's only using pretty solid fighters other than that terrible leader of theirs. But when you have all drill masters and the bowless guys, that's all pretty solid fighters. They just have such terrible abilities that even that doesn't save them in a competitive environment. So let's jump on to C tier. Um, a really cool, really interesting tier. This is where all of these are pretty solid warbands that have some spice that would make them pretty formidable in any kind of casual game, right? So um, the casual lists people tend to build that don't fall that wouldn't be equal in D tier for this competitive tier list, they would all kind of be in C. Um, be in C, not be equal to B and C. Um, so things like, these Stormcast ones, right? They've got, they've got the big drawback of having so few models, but Stormcast Warriors and Stormcast Sacrosanct each have access to at least one just like really powerful, mobile, damaging, tanky unit, just one really good elite unit each. And so that sort of brings them up into the C tier, right? And that's kind of one of the two ways to be in this tier is you're either missing a really important tool that would give them competitive polish, whether it's a cheap chaff unit or nothing really mobile, something like that, or it's just a really fundamentally unsound warband with a couple tricks that kick them up a notch. So something like Iron Jaws is like that, where they really have a numbers and a mobility problem, but that War Chanter has incredible abilities that easily keep them out of the D and F tiers. Um, then you have, say, something like Cypher Lords, which are just barely missing out of B tier. They have a lot of great options in there. It's just that they're just they fold to a stiff breeze, right? And so that can be a real problem for them. And the cool Cypher Slide combo, for how difficult it is to pull off, right? It's not doing as much for you as you would like compared to some of the other factions. Um, but in a tournament setting, these are fine to bring, right? They would really struggle against some of the S and A tier factions that we'll go over, but um, they could beat any B tier list that's out here. Um, one fun one that I wanted to talk about is Nurgle Rotbringers with an ally, the Aviarch from Tzeentch Mortals. Um, Again, it might be sort of uh, heresy to bring Tzeentch into a Nurgle list, but if you wanted to, you can really pump Nurgle up quite a bit by just adding in um, that sort of mobile dragon out of Tzeentch that can just really help them out. Also, kind of fun to look here at two of the very top budget lists. If you do bring them into a competitive setting, right, with Slaves to Darkness and Slaanesh, they do manage to sneak into C tier, and I find that putting those top 5 budget lists into this really helps contextualize some of the other factions, right? Um, Now we get into B tier, and all of these factions that you see here these are really high functioning competitive warbands. To bring the competitive list that I had in my starter video for any of these into a casual game would be pretty rude. The, these can all of these factions can produce very polished um, competitive lists. So if you're in a casual setting, you do probably want to handicap a little bit here. Um, Now, one surprise I think that would get a lot of people, I'll keep talking about this, I guess, but is Seraphon. Seraphon is one of the most complained about factions in the game when you see people online. People hate skinks, but one funny thing that I see when people complain and then they say what's going on um, with a game where Seraphon just tabled someone super quickly with a bunch of skinks, it's always um, one of the most hard competitive ways to run Seraphon of just like a whole bunch of skinks versus like a completely casual, maybe like an out of the box Warcry Warband. Like it's one of those lists where people just all of a sudden gravitate to the most intense way to play it right away, and they seem to always be saying like, "I found this completely broken warband," but then it's against something extremely casual. There are really hardcore lists that other warbands can make that just don't seem to get talked about a whole bunch, right? So these have a lot of sort of extremely spammable chaff in these warbands. I don't think there's anything that gets into this tier that doesn't have an extremely reliable chaff unit, except for bone splitters, and I'll talk more about them later. But otherwise, you are looking at people or sorry, warbands that just have a ton of the tools and are creating really polished competitive lists here. Any of these in B tier could beat an S tier warband on any given day. Um, Another cool thing is you see a lot of the Warcry specific warbands here, right? Corvus Cabal, Unmade, Scions of the Flame, all of them have ways to min-max them to get you kind of right up there competing with just about anybody. Though none of those do quite as good a job as Splintered Fang that does manage to land in A tier. Um, this is sort of the tier full of warbands that get to run the total package. So while B tier is sort of very polished, you know, powerful all-around lists that you can get to, um, A tier is you're adding something extra, or you just have a little bit of everything, right? Numbers, reach, damage, all of these factions up here can do all of those things. And usually you're adding something else that's a little bit spicy, right? So, for example, Seraphon with a KO ally, that combo just can do an incredible amount of damage. Or something you see in a lot of these is the combination of spammable chaff plus a hugely mobile sort of high damage dragon unit, right? So like Beasts of Chaos can run tons of gores and they're really good, but then they also get to choose between the Cockatrice and the Doom Bull as just extremely high level heavy hitters. Um, Flesh Eater Quartz is sort of the gatekeeper into this tier. Um, they have all those ghouls, which ghouls are essentially just plains runners, right? Except that you also have the 2 giant flyers. By the way, mentioning plains runners makes me remember that I completely forgot to put them on this chart. They would come in here at the sort of top of C tier, bottom of B tier sort of area here. One fun exception to that is Splintered Fang. They're a lot less well-rounded than the other warbands in this group, but snakes are just completely broken. So that kind of brings a warband that would otherwise be kind of high C um, into A, just because snakes are so ridiculous. Um, Cities of Sigmar are also kind of a fun one. Um, None of their individual tools are sort of incredibly best in class, but the way they're able to have different things in different deployment areas and just completely flood the board at the same time with the ridiculous Tempest Eye rule set really bumps them up quite a bit. Um, all of these are just absolutely dangerous warbands to face if your opponent is min-maxing, and something that you could easily take to a tournament and look to be taking down the entire thing. Um, that said, they're not quite as busted as the last four that I've got here. Now, each of these four warbands gets to do something completely game-breaking. Um, let's start with Skaven, right? Because they're always the elephant in the room, talking sort of power levels in Warcry. Even the budget list of all Plague Monks still manages to sneak into A tier, right? So the fully powered Skaven, which is sort of half Pestilence, half Molder, is sort of even an extra step of the other three broken warbands. They get two separate, really powerful combos, right? They have the Packmaster plus Rat Ogre situation, which, by the way, if you just want to smash and you don't want to have to deal with getting abilities exactly right, just putting in the toughest melee um, Storm Fiend will replace the Rat Ogre combo just fine in any of your Skaven lists and give you, 99% of the utility, maybe more like 95%. But either way, be really powerful. Um, then they also have the ability to do their AOE attack buff with Plague Monks having 2-inch range, which is just completely ridiculous. And then they also have Giant Rats, which, if you remember my Math Hammer video, those actually came out #1 in terms of the highest single unit rating in the game for my algorithm. They're absolutely busted. So having all three of those things just kind of puts Skaven a section ahead. One of my listeners did post on one of my videos that, you know, their theory is that it's all the mold lines on some of the old Skaven molder models that made GW decide that they wanted to make them completely broken just to move old product. Who am I to say that they're wrong? After Skaven, we have Stormcast Bird Guard. They're really here because they have just Aether Wings are just ridiculous. They're just incredibly good, just at straight winning missions. And then, um, you know, in the video that I made for all the order lists, I gave like 4 or 5 different takes on a really highly competitive Stormcast Vanguard list. All of them come out pretty similar in terms of the rating, but the common thread through all of them is just really solid shooting backed up by absolute dominance in the objective game. Um, and that just puts them in this situation where beating them is just really, really hard. Slanesh gets to play aggro and control at the same time, which feels really unfair when you're playing against them. And just the Contorted Epitome's ability to completely lock down the opponent's best unit while killing a chaff unit, uh, that's broken on its own. But then when you couple it with the fact that Fiends of Slanesh also have a control ability that's just on a double instead of a triple, so you can use them in the same round. And you have Demonettes being one of the better damage mobile chaff units in the game. Just gives you this warband that's, you know, it's pushing out damage as well as any B tier, some of the A tier warbands, and it's also locking down your opponent at the same time. Completely oppressive to play against, right? Then we have Ogre Maw tribes. The Thunder Fists, using your wild dice to only produce doubles, no triples, is the most efficient way to clear chaff in the entire game, which on its own would be enough to get even like a not very well-rounded warband into B tier, maybe even A tier. But then they also have Noblars, which are just disgusting as a chaff unit. They only cost 45 points, which is ridiculous. They even do more damage than the other 45 point ridiculous chaff units, right? Gloomspite Gitz has access to netters, who are insane. But Noblars even get to do more damage than netters. And they don't miss the netting ability because you're happily using your doubles on your Thunderfists anyway, right? So all four of those warbands get to just completely break the game when you play against them. Um, and so that's why they get to be an S tier. So let's get into some quick details about some list changes just from my starter list video before I get into some fun graphs. So Seraphon is a really interesting one, right? I think it's one of the big surprises. Um, so in my video, I had a list that was 1 Scarvet, 2 Knights, and 8 Skinks. The thing I realized, I even say it in that video and in my guide to Seraphon that you can check out. It's a year old at this point, but it still covers almost everything. They only added a few things in the Grand Alliance books, but I just have this obsession with Saurus Knights. I love how tanky they are for what their role is. The problem is having all of them, with the point being to grab objectives, is not as effective since they all have the mount keyword, right? So having a Pterodon in there really helps if you don't want an ally. And then you can also ally in for just combo ridiculousness. I really underestimated how much a Caradron Overlord's ally adds to the Seraphon damage output. Um, yeah, so 8 Skinks will do 26 to 32 damage per round in the best case scenario, which I would say is when they just get to all be shooting instead of moving around. Um, but a Gunnery Sergeant using the ability, plus you have a Salamander and the Handler and 2 Skinks, which, by the way, that's only one deployment group, right? So the 8 Skinks is your entire list from all the deployment groups. That's the range damage output, right? This is just one deployment group here, and it's doing 36 to 60 damage, depending on toughnesses of your opponents, per round in the best case scenario. So if your opponent is all toughness 3, which is usually the most competitive toughness to be playing at, um, you're just doing 60 damage in a round. So that's enough to blow a lot of warbands completely tabled off the board. That's if they're not being smart about terrain, obviously, but still, right? This is a situation where you're just putting an absurd amount of pressure onto them. That's why they're sort of there at the top of A. You could argue that they should be in S tier when they have a KO ally. I'm totally, willing to accept that argument, right? Uh, the only issue here is that the Scarvet does really want to use the triple. Any of their Saurus leaders would love to have a triple, but you just get so much versatility, right? You can, in a battle round where you have the shooting lanes you want, you can just plunk the Gunnery Sergeant down and just blow the opponent off the board. And in the rounds where you have to, stretch out to go hit something farther away, using the triple on the Scarvet, or something, behind terrain, using the triple on the Scarvet is incredibly valuable there. So that's why I changed up the Seraphon list. I do think that this Caradron Overlord's ally list is an absolutely absurd competitive list to take. I also have some notes with Slaves to Darkness. The epitome list from the video, I left it in for the tier list, but it did score 3/4, so less than 1 point lower, but still a little bit lower than a Varangard list I made, which is just one Varangard, a Marauder Horseman, and then just spamming 10 Marauders. The problem there is just that the epitome hogs all the triples, and the Slaves to Darkness leaders are actually extremely triple hungry. They have multiple really good triples at their disposal, and so then adding a contorted epitome is just yet another one. So even though in that video I said that tactically the really nice thing with a contorted is to have another thing that's doing a ton of damage is a ton of threat in your list. That's absolutely true. But just from a dice mechanics point of view, they kind of fight there. So this Vanguard list, about the same kind of quality, right? Obviously, as soon as you drop an epitome, you're just dropping a ton of power there. Um, so it does take a lot to make up for it. So you're not actually improving a ton by not having it, but it's just nice that Slaves to Darkness can have a similar power level without it. Legions of Nagash, if you noticed, I kept both competitive lists that I made in the tier list to just show how close they are, whether or not you want to build around an abhorrent Archregent ally or the Necromancer situation. Both are just so close. Sybarites, since I had a contorted epitome in that one, I just wanted to note that here's the Sybarites list I would use, right? A Slakehorn, 3 Fiend Bloods, 2 Bliss Barb Archers, and a Twin Soul. If I wasn't going to ally in anything, it would be a little bit lower, right? It would be at the bottom of C instead of kind of solidly in B tier. And it would, really be right at the bottom of C. I think maybe a little higher than the Nurgle with the Aviarch, but certainly lower than Iron Jaws. They do they struggle with just the fact that your chaff unit, Bliss Barbs, just don't bring enough to the table. So, what were the surprises here? So, one definitely is Seraphon. I already touched on it, just that the basic list of Seraphon that people generally are scared of. I do think that's a bit of a pub stompy list. They don't really go into overdrive, I think, until you bring a KO ally, or actually also the Lumineth High Sentinel ally also overdrives them really well. That would also be high A tier. Um, so fifth best, certainly isn't a disappointment, but I do think it's lower than their reputation. It's just so funny, anytime you look at people online sort of showing what lists they played against their buddies, they always just have um, a really competitive Seraphon list against a buddy's, like, just sort of dregs of whatever faction they're using, and then that's what causes all the complaints. I don't understand why this is the one faction everybody min maxes, but that seems to be how it is. It's just that there's so many other factions that can also do the same thing. um, Idoneth Deepkin, I have it a little lower than I think a lot of people would have it. It's still really solid, right? Very top of B. um, I think I rate the combo ability High Tide a little bit lower than other folks do. It's just, it's so possible for a competitive warband. So I know that damage is it is the most important thing. I've said this many times on my channel. I think other people who comment on Warcry will say it a lot. Damage is the most important thing to be able to do, but it's not like tankiness doesn't matter, right? And Idoneth Deepkin, their whole combo is based on the third round overdrive of their chaff units, but their chaff units are incredibly easy to kill, and it's actually really hard to get a ton of them into a list. So that is, what they suffer from. Obviously, I'm not trashing them here. I have them at the top of B, which I said everything in B you could potentially win a tournament with. I just don't have them quite as high as I think a lot of other folks do. There's also a thing between Daughters of Cain and Corvus Cabal. So they have Sisters of Slaughter and the Cabalite with Spear have an identical stat line. Um, However, I just think that the Bloodrack Medusa is absolutely one of the very best heavyweight units in the game, and that's what I think brings Daughters of Cain up into A tier, right? They get a ton of ability points just because of how completely overwhelmingly oppressive that ability is. Um, and also it can one-shot kill chaff units. Corvus Cabal are still great, right? Shrike Talons are still great. Having 2 of them is really good in a list. Again, I'm not putting them low on my tier list, but um, that is why I just have Daughters of Cain so much higher, despite the fact that their chaff unit is equal there. Lumineth Realm Lords, they when their new stuff came out and it was so much more aggressively pointed than everything that was there before, I think I and a lot of other people were really shocked and really impressed, and rightly so, right? It took a faction that would have been kind of pretty low C tier, I think, before. Um, just really high up. I think the High Sentinel is still really incredible. I think that their other leaders are really solid too. Um, and then their 95-point swordmen are really incredible, but at 95 points, you're not fitting a ton of them into a list. And, you know, I really do think that leveraging chaff as much as you can is what, um, you know, gives you the biggest advantage in the most deployment plus victory condition combos. And there are still other factions that can chaff up better. Again, Lumineth Realm Lord's still pretty high up here, but um, not as high as I think a lot of people hyped up when their new rules came out a couple months ago. Um, Kind of a funny situation between Legions of Nagash and Kharadron Overlords. I've kind of always quietly thought that KO were sort of just a better Legions of Nagash, just because um, the Arcanaut with Spear is just a better Graveguard when you look at what it does at 3-inch movement versus what Graveguards do at 3-inch movement. Uh, the damage is the same against toughness 3, which again is the most important toughness to be able to kill, except that KO Spearmen just have that extra point of reach, right? So it's just a better unit. Um, same price, I think actually cheaper for the same stuff, except just better in every way. The issue here is, of course, that Legions of Nagash just have access to better abilities, which is why they're a little bit higher there. Finally, Bone Splitters. It's so funny. I think I owe an apology to all Bone Splitters players after how much I've trashed them kind of in the early days of the channel. Um, when you have the boar riding leader, Bone Splitters are really good. That boar riding leader is really solid. B tier, so Bone Splitters are the one exception of B tier. I think I said that to get into that tier, you had to have a really good chaff unit. Bone Splitters don't have a great chaff unit, but you know the two guys holding the giant spear, they do a good amount of damage. Their chaff, while they aren't very good, they are very tanky. And then again, the boar riding leader is a really solid piece. Not as good as obviously a lot of the dragons that are in these A tier warbands, but tons of damage for 10-inch move. That mount keyword is going to be a huge drawback in some games, but in other games, it's not going to be a drawback at all, and it's just going to be an incredible piece. So just really funny. I'm sorry to all Bone Splitters players. Here's your apology. Uh, Really interesting state of balance when you sort of line up all of the warbands by score. Um, Skaven, as you can see, has an entire section all to themselves. Their leg up over the rest of S tier is actually bigger than S tier's advantage over A. So, for example, here's Stormcast Vanguard, and then Maw Tribes and Slaanesh are right here. And this being the rest of S tier. So obviously, Skaven's pretty incredible here. Also, you can see F and D tiers really are in a league of their own. So, the list that I show of everyone all together, those two tiers are so much smaller than all the others, but it really just felt like that's how I had to do it, just to communicate how far away they were from the rest of it. Everything else, once you get past S tier, A, B, and C are actually pretty close together, right? From 65 to 80 essentially is what's going on there, and you know, very closely grouped, especially once you get into just B and A against each other, right? There's not a ton of separation there. Um, so I think that that's a great sign. You know, when people talk about Warcry not being very balanced, um, a lot of that comes from the early days of Warcry, where that was true. The Grand Alliance books did an awesome job, I think, giving lots of different factions the tools that they needed to fight, right? So, all of these have tools to make really well-rounded warbands, and these C tier ones that don't, they have abilities that sort of bring them up into that conversation that make it so that they could beat any of these warbands on any given day. And so I think that that's a really great job. The place where Warcry is really unbalanced is in the min-maxing within factions. If you're not taking your best chaff units, if you're not spamming, the best things you have to offer, a lot of casual lists are just going to be really far down. Um, you know, most say a casual Daughters of Cain list is going to be around D, right? If you're not bringing either Sisters of Slaughter or Witch Elves, you're gonna really struggle with them. Sylvaneth is the same, right? Sylvaneth, if you're not min-maxing to your utmost, you are going to be really low. I think that's where there's a lack of balance, where if you just kind of um, point to your favorite unit in a lot of these, you're not going to end up with a competitive warband. But I think that's okay, right? I think that that's would be true of a lot of games. Certainly, the big games, 40K, AOS, that would absolutely be true. You wouldn't be able to just kind of point to a unit and necessarily make it work. Um, Here, for any folks who want to see the exact numbers, here it is kind of sorted by total score. So you can see here the break between Skaven and Stormcast Vanguard being so huge. Um, oh, I could have absolutely justified putting the break in A tier at the spot between Beasts of Chaos and Tzeentch Mortals here. See, so you could have said, say, Skavener and S all on their own, and then A tier is everything between Stormcast Vanguard and Beasts of Chaos. Certainly these three, this sort of three-way tie at 77.6, these are sort of closer in some ways to this top tier than they are the rest of A, but the drop off between Maw Tribes and Khorne/Seraphon is bigger than the drop off between Beasts of Chaos and Tzeentch. Significantly bigger. So that's why I split it there. But you could communicate it a different way there. Um, you could also say that, you know, you could justify putting Idoneth Deepkin as the gatekeeper for A tier, right, based on, these two differences, but that's really a judgment call. You could go either way. So there it is. Some guy's competitive tier list for everyone to argue about. If you made it this far, please consider hitting the like button. It'll help other people find the video. What I mean when I say that is that, the more sort of engagement a video gets, the more it gets suggested to new people. So folks who are interested in Warcry out there, but who maybe don't know exactly where to find it, they're more likely to get suggested it on YouTube. I will be back with sort of more kind of interesting things now that I've sort of collated all this data. I get some really interesting stuff to look at as far as like warbands that get the biggest boost from going from their budget version to their most competitive version, things like that. Or I've had a few people asking me to put all of my sort of casual lists that I created in my videos into a tier list for themselves. Um, I'll think about doing something like that. I'll want to do more than just kind of list power with that. We'll see what kind of rubric for kind of spiciness I can bring in for those sweet casual lists. Um, but yeah, I'll definitely do something along those lines. And also, we've got the new Age of Sigmar coming up in just a few weeks here. So I definitely want to talk with folks about, how to get into Age of Sigmar using Warcry. And I'm excited to do stuff like that. So I may be slowing down videos until the new Age of Sigmar drops, but I'll certainly be ramping back up once that happens. So until then, may all your rolls be crits.